Okay, so before we begin, I just want to remind everybody that for next time you're reading Mary Shelley's short story, The Mortal Immortal. It's near the end of the Romantic Age volume, and this will be the next to last thing we're going to be reading in Volume D, right? After the chapter on Orientalism that we're going to look at on Tuesday, we're going to be switching to the Victorian volume, right? We're going to be switching to Volume E. So be prepared for that in the middle of next week, right? Now, as far as the music I was pointing today is concerned, I do want to talk a little bit about this. So what you were hearing was about the first half of Franz Schubert's Unfinished Symphony. And I chose this for today for a couple of reasons. One of which being that Schubert and Keats are nearly exact contemporaries. Keats is born in 1795 and dies in 1821. And Schubert is born in 1797 and dies in 1828. So they're almost exactly the same age, right? Schubert is 2 years younger. And they both die young. Keats of tuberculosis, Schubert probably of complications from syphilis. The other thing that they have in common is they both leave behind, despite their short lives, a very large body of work. They're both very prolific while alive. And they both leave a lot of work unfinished. And I think that the notion of this unfinished symphony relates really well to Keats's very short productive life, right? So, there's this notion of a body of work that gets cut short too soon. Now, by the time Keats is writing, one thing we have to remember is that Romanticism is no longer the new thing in British art and British literature, right? Keats is part of a second generation of Romantic writers who were influenced by and reacting to that older generation like Wordsworth and Coleridge that we were talking about last time, right? So Wordsworth and Coleridge, when they come on the scene in 1798, are the daring young radicals, right? By 1815 or so, they're the boring old farts. And this younger generation is both using stuff they got from Coleridge and Wordsworth and attacking them at the same time, right? The way young writers often eat their influences, right? So by this time, right, so mid-18 teens, roughly, right? The Eve of St. Agnes was written in 1819, published in 1820. Romantic writers are being divided up into distinct schools, right? So, damn it. One thing to remember about early 19th century literary culture is it was kind of focused, a lot of it was focused around magazines and periodical publishing. And two of the most influential magazines were published, they were both published in Edinburgh, in Scotland. There was the Edinburgh Review, and Blackwood's magazine. The Edinburgh Review tended to be a bit more liberal in its politics. Blackwood's was conservative. But they were both mostly concerned not just with politics, but also with culture. And the critics of Blackwood's magazine sorted the Romantic poets of Keats's day into a couple of different groups. So the older poets who were associated with that Lake District in northwestern England that we talked about, that Dorothy Wordsworth wrote so evocatively about, right, would be Wordsworth, Coleridge, and Robert Southey, whom we haven't encountered yet. We'll look at one of his poems when we look at Romanticism and Orientalism. Southey is someone who is like, his early reputation has not survived to the present day, right? He's someone who was much celebrated and much read at the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th centuries, and his reputation has since fallen off. Opposed to the Lake School, the Blackwoods writers created two other schools. The first, they called the Cockney School. Does anybody know what a Cockney is? No, it actually, it has to do with social class and also with where you're from.
Is it like a magnet school?
No, it's nothing to do with schooling necessarily, although they were often regarded as uneducated by other people. How many have ever seen like a movie, where there are lots of like little plucky British chimney sweeps? You speak in an accent like this, and shine your shoes, governor. Right? That's a Cockney accent, right? It's a working class London accent. So Cockney means working class Londoner, essentially. And it originates in a particular neighborhood in London. And the writers associated with this school are the essayist William Hazlitt, the poet and publisher Leigh Hunt, and John Keats. And what these writers have in common is a working class background. Right? So Wordsworth, Coleridge, and Southey were all members of kind of like the upper middle class to lower gentry, right? So they came from a more relatively privileged background, at least financially. Keats was the son of a stable groom who was studying medicine in his late teens, early 20s, and turned to writing poetry. He never actually practiced medicine. But he is sort of, in a lot of ways, kind of like the image of the upwardly mobile young poet, right? He's a working class kid who has got some education and is trying to make his way in a world that has largely been reserved for his social betters, right? Now, the third school that Blackwoods identifies, they call the Satanic School. And they call it this because the poets of this school are associated not with literal devil worship, but with rebellion against established authority. Right? So it's the image of Satan as rebel, not necessarily Satan as demonic lord of the underworld. But again, for Blackwoods, which tended to be conservative in its politics, this was still bad, right? So this would be include poets like Lord Byron, Percy Shelley, and once again, Leigh Hunt, who seems to have really pissed off someone at Blackwoods at some point. Now, one other thing to keep in mind about this younger generation of romantics, particularly the main three, right, who were Byron, Shelley, and Keats, is that they all live short lives. All three of these men died young. Right? Byron is dead by 35. He goes off to Greece to fight in the Greek War of Independence against the Ottomans, and is bitten by a mosquito and dies of tropical fever. Shelley drowns off the coast of Italy at age 29. And Keats is dead of tuberculosis at 26. So one of the keynotes of the work of this particular generation, and this is probably just us kind of reading backwards historically because we know none of them are going to live long, is kind of like, the brevity of life, right? Now, with this little bit of sort of background on Keats and on the general literary context of this period, what questions do you guys have about the Eve of St. Agnes? How did this one go for you? Didn't understand what was going on, or
it was certain lines that I felt like I knew what was going on. Then it kind of went and did something else. Like it was certain lines that stood out that kind of told me what was going on. But throughout the poem, I didn't really get it unless it was those particular lines.
Okay, and it is narrative, right? There is a plot here. There is a plot here. How many of you are able to figure out what the basic plot is here? What's going on in the poem? Was there anything you were able to figure out about what was going on in the poem?
It seemed like something supernatural was going on. That's what I could kind of tell, if I'm correct. It seemed like it.
And I think it's made to seem like there is something supernatural going on. And that supernatural happening kind of blends into something less so, right, as the poem progresses. Right? But on the basic level of plot, what happens here? Can anybody tell me?
Is this someone getting cursed? No?
No one is getting cursed. Yeah, there is no curse involved here. In fact, like for a poem that is influenced by the Gothic, this is relatively free of elements of conventional horror, although there is some supernaturalism here, right? And the setting is clearly medieval.
Okay.
So what we have here is a party on January 20th, right? That is the eve of St. Agnes. The feast day of St. Agnes is the 21st, so the eve of St. Agnes is the 20th of January. And one of the things the poem is riffing on is a folk tradition in which if a young woman follows a certain ritual prescription, she has to fast for the day, she has to abstain from certain behaviors, she has to undress in a particular way, and then go to bed and not look before or behind her, but only look up. And she is then supposed to be able to see the image of her future husband, right? So that's the folklore tradition that the poem is referencing. That is what Madeline is doing when Porphyro sneaks into her chamber. Right? So, but most of the plot here revolves around, right, these two young lovers, Porphyro and Madeline, given continental European names. Porphyro is Italian, Madeline is French, which would reference that Gothic tradition, right? Those Gothic novels we talked about a couple weeks ago, right, almost never take place in England. They almost always take place in Europe or France or Spain, right? Old Catholic Europe.
And these aren't real people, right?
These are not real people, no. These are fictional people. Yeah. So Porphyro and Madeline are young lovers who are kept apart because Porphyro is the enemy of Madeline's family, right? So Madeline seems to be the daughter of a powerful baron who was having a feast at his estate on St. Agnes Eve. And Madeline slips out of the feast unnoticed to perform her St. Agnes Eve ritual, right? And at the same time, Porphyro is taking advantage of the fact that everyone else is distracted to sneak into the house to see Madeline. And he's helped by this aged servant, right? This old woman who lives in the house, who is referred to as Angela. She helps him sneak into Madeline's chamber after he assures her that his intentions are honorable. Although that's a little bit questionable. He hides in Madeline's closet, watches her undress, and go to bed. And then when she is asleep and dreaming of her future husband, as per the folklore ritual, he lays out a feast beside the bed, sneaks into it, and wakes her up by playing a tune on a lute.
So this person is a creature, right? Both of them are creatures or monsters, or they're actually...
No, they're human. They're human beings.
Okay.
Yeah, they're not monsters. They're
That's
human.
what I was asking.
They are human beings. Yes.
Okay.
They are, young adult humans. Right? This is. No monsters here. Yeah.
Can you explain is there something behind the feast that he laid out, and he snuck into it?
Yes, and we actually, I will talk about that. I'm just trying to lay out the plot here for everybody first. But yeah, the fact that he does kind of lay out this feast actually is important for various reasons. So she wakes up, she sees him there. Reality melts into her dream, which suggests that they probably have sex. And then they sneak out of the house together, right? And he takes her off to his home. So that's what's happening in the poem, right? That's the basic plot. Now let's look at the way the elements of it are assembled, right? So first off, like Coleridge, Keats is writing in a deliberately old-fashioned mode. In fact, he's writing in a way that is kind of doubly old-fashioned, right? So the whole poem is written in what are called Spenserian stanzas. So a Spenserian stanza is 8 lines. The rhyme scheme is A, B, A, B, B. C, B, C, C. I had to remind myself of that. The first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Oh, no, they're 9-line stanzas, yeah. The first 8 lines are pentameter, that is, they are 10-syllable lines. The final line is what's called an alexandrine. Which is a 12-syllable line. So the final line is always longer than the others. Now, the reason they're called Spenserian stanzas is they were invented by the 16th century poet Edmund Spenser. Do any of you know who Edmund Spenser was, or what the name of his best-known work is? Have any of you ever heard of Edmund Spenser before? Okay, so Edmund Spenser was the author of a long epic poem called The Faerie Queene. And The Faerie Queene is a long allegorical poem about questing knights in the service of a monarch who is clearly meant to represent Queen Elizabeth I. And each of the knights represents a particular virtue. So the knight of the first book is the Red Cross knight who represents piety. The knight of the second book is Sir Guyon who represents temperance, that sort of thing, right? Now the reason this is important, the reason why it matters that Keats chose this mode, right, is that what Spenser was writing was a style of work that was already out of fashion by the time he's writing in the 16th century. So he's writing what's essentially a medieval romance. And romance in this context doesn't refer to love stories. A romance in this context refers instead to long narratives about questing knights. Again, the sort of thing that was already kind of outmoded in early modern England. So Spenser was looking backwards. And Keats is taking a cue from Coleridge, who wrote in a kind of archaic language in the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, right? But he's choosing a form of archaic language that is itself also artificial and even further backward looking, right? So the whole idea here is to try to evoke the Middle Ages, but to do so in a way that is also kind of artificial, right? Does this make sense to everybody? Everybody with me? Okay, where did I lose you, Valencia?
You're like, okay, well, first of all, it's a whole bunch of, like, well, the way it's written,
Uh-huh.
it's hard to understand.
Yeah.
So,
And it would have been relatively difficult for an early 19th century reader too, because he is writing in a way that's deliberately old-fashioned, right?
So, for us right now, I mean, it's very old-fashioned.
Yeah.
Even back then, he's writing in old-fashioned to his time. So it must.
Yeah. So yeah. So what I would suggest, like one thing that might help, right, is if you take a look at this specific poem, and you say compare it to the language, say that Wordsworth uses in Tintern Abbey, right? So like it was a little difficult sometimes to determine what was going on in Tintern Abbey, right? But it's not usually that hard to figure out what words mean there, right? Like Wordsworth is using a more modern vocabulary. Keats had access, of course, to the same modern vocabulary, but he's choosing not to use it because he is trying to evoke the atmosphere of an earlier period. Does this make sense? And yeah, it does make it more difficult. And like even like people reading it in 1820 when it was first published would have needed some footnotes and some little glosses in the margins, right? And indeed, even like a lot of the social concepts here that are discussed in the poem are things that would have been long outmoded, right? So, for example, how many of you know what a beadsman is?
Say it again.
A beadsman. Does anybody know what a beadsman is without looking at the footnote?
Isn't it someone who maybe works for someone? Isn't it a certain person that works for somebody?
I mean, it is a kind of servant, yeah.
Yeah, that's what I meant.
But the beadsman's role is pretty highly specific, right? So a beadsman is someone a medieval nobleman would have paid to pray for him. So essentially, it was a way that you could kind of outsource prayer, right? You hire the beadsman to hang out and live in the chapel, and then you don't have to go yourself. Yeah, go ahead, Alex.
One part that I didn't quite understand was how that related to the rest of the story at all. Like, what was the connection to this?
Okay, so there is actually a connection here, and it's more a connection of contrast, right? So the poem starts with the lonely beadsman praying his rosary in a cold chapel that's full of all of these still figures, right? Let's actually go right to page 961. And can I get a volunteer to start reading? Just to start with to start with the very beginning, from St. Agnes Eve, bitter chill it was. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. St. Agnes Eve, bitter chill it was. The owl for all his feathers was a cold, the hair limp trembling through the frozen grass, and silent was the flock in woolly fold. Numb were the beadsman's fingers while he told his rosary, and while his frosted breath like pious incense from a censer old, seemed taking fight for heaven without a dove past the sweet Virgin's picture, by his prayer he saved.
Okay, thanks. So what this is doing is setting a scene for us, right? And what sense of the night do we get? What seems to be the dominant sensory experience here? Cold, yeah. The whole idea here is to give you a sense of cold, right? Even the animals that live out in the cold normally are uncomfortable, right? And the beadsman is sitting here alone in a cold chapel praying his rosary while his breath visibly escapes from his body, right? Almost like a soul rising up, leaving his body, right? And this is meant, right, that this idea of cold is something that continues in the next two stanzas, right? Can I get somebody to read from his prayer he saith, this patient holy man?
His prayer he said.
Thank you, Valencia.
His prayer he said, this patient holy man, then takes his lamp and recess from his knees, and
back returneth.
Returneth, merged barefoot man along the chapel aisle by slow degrees. The sculptured dead on each side seem to freeze, imprisoned in black. Purgatorial rails, nights, ladies praying in the dome.
Oratories.
He passes by his weak spirit fails to think how they made aching icy hoods and mills.
Okay, so let's think of how this image then contributes to the sense of cold, right? What's the dominant visual image, particularly in the second part of the stanza? What's described here for us?
The statue.
Yeah, we have these statues, right? The sculptured dead on each side seem to freeze, imprisoned in black purgatorial rails. Do you guys know what purgatory is?
Isn't it hell?
It's not hell. In Catholic theology, purgatory is kind of in between heaven and hell. So purgatory is where you go if you still have minor unconfessed sins on your conscience, right? If you have major unconfessed sins on your conscience for which you've not atoned, you go to hell. If you have minor unconfessed sins, you go to purgatory. And the idea in purgatory is that then you work those sins off and will eventually be permitted to go to heaven, right? But so the idea here is that these knights and ladies, these sculpted figures, are somehow in this kind of in-between place, right? You know, they're looking up to heaven. Their mouths are open in prayer, but they're still and silent and stuck in place, right? Alex, you had a question?
Oh, that's what I was going to ask.
Okay, yeah. So the image of the still knights and ladies, right, contributes to this notion of cold and of a frozen situation, right? So the chapel, the way it's described to us, is lifeless, right? Even the beadsman himself seems kind of lifeless, right? Northward he turneth through a little door, and scarce 3 steps, ere music's golden tongue flattered to tears this aged man and poor. But no, already had his death bell rung. The joys of all his life were said and sung. His was harsh penance on St. Agnes Eve. Another way he went, and soon among rough ashes he sat for his soul's reprieve, and all night kept awake for sinners' sake to grieve. So this guy sleeps in ashes to remind him of life's final end, right? You know, ashes to ashes, dust to dust. So the beadsman is someone who is almost kind of dead while alive, right? Everything he does is for the sake of someone else. And yeah, he has no real life of his own, right? He hears the music from the party, but he knows that's not for him, and he goes the other way, right? So what we get, starting from the 4th stanza, is this notion of the frozen, icy, still chapel starting to melt into light and heat and motion. Right? The ancient beadsman heard the prelude soft, and so it chanced, for many a door was wide from hurry to and fro. Soon, up aloft, the silver snarling trumpets 'gan to chide. The level chambers, ready with their pride, were glowing to receive 1,000 guests. The carved angels, ever eager-eyed, stared, where upon their heads the cornice rests, with hair blown back and wings put crosswise on their breasts. So even like the carved angels here are given the illusion of motion, right? The illusion of movement, which the carved knights and ladies were not. Now I think it's also important to note the music here, the way it's described. Why the silver snarling trumpets? What does that suggest?
You're trying to say that the trumpets are really loud, or?
Yeah, I mean they're probably loud, right? But what kinds of emotions or attitudes do we usually associate with snarling? Pardon?
I said dog.
Okay, yeah, a dog when it's angry snarls, right? What are you going to say, Alex?
Obnoxious.
Yeah, obnoxious, arrogant, right? So these trumpets, these snarling trumpets, represent the arrogance and the power of Madeline's family, right? And from the dark chapel, right, we see the level chambers where the feast is happening were glowing to receive 1,000 guests, right? So instead of being cold and dark and lonely like the chapel, the inside of the estate is glowing with light and heat, and it's filled with people, right? Can I get somebody to start reading from stanza 5? At length burst in the argent revelry. Yeah, go ahead, Jesse.
At length burst in the argent revelry, with a plumed tiara and all rich array. Numerous as shadows haunting fairly, the brain, new stuff, and you with triumphs gay of old romance. These let us wish away, and turn soul thoughted to one lady there, whose heart had brooded all that wintry day. On love and wings, Saint Agnes' saintly care, as she had heard old dames full many times declare.
Okay, so now we're zeroing in on Madeline, right? She hasn't been named yet, but she's been pointed out to us, right? Okay, so here is one within the, just as the beadsman is one alone, performing his silent prayers, right? All by himself. Here is one in the midst of the party who is not participating in the revelry, right? Here is one who is doing her own thing. Now, St. Agnes, for those of you who don't know, and this is actually kind of important and maybe a little ironic given the content of the poem, St. Agnes is the patron saint of virginity and chastity.
Isn't there a school called that, if I'm correct?
There are actually lots of schools that are named for St. Agnes. They're fairly common. It's fairly common for churches and for Catholic churches and for their attached schools to be named for St. Agnes.
That's what I was thinking. I've been saying since I was saying I hear a lot of schools like that. They must be Christian schools.
Yeah. I think especially given her association with protecting childhood and innocence. She's sort of an appropriate patron saint for a school, right? But in this case, the evocation is almost ironic, given what Porphyro has come to do, right? That Madeline devotes herself to this rite sanctioned by St. Agnes, apparently, and Porphyro kind of comes in and uses the opportunity to seduce her, right? So there's an irony in that here. Right. They told her how, upon St. Agnes Eve, young virgins might have visions of delight, and soft adorings for their loves receive, upon the honeyed middle of the night, if ceremonies due they did aright. As supperless to bed they must retire, and couch supine their beauties lily white, nor look behind nor sideways, but require of heaven with upward eyes for all that they desire. Full of this whim was thoughtful Madeline. The music, yearning like a god in pain, she scarcely heard. Her maiden eyes divine, fixed on the floor, saw many a sweeping train pass by. She heeded not at all. In vain came many a tiptoe, amorous cavalier, and back retired, not cooled by high disdain. But she saw not. Her heart was otherwhere. She sighed for Agnes' dreams, the sweetest of the year. So there's this party happening all around her, right? And what sorts of images do we get of the party? What's going on around her?
It's loud.
Okay, it's loud.
Everybody having fun.
Yep, everybody's having fun. People are dancing, right? Who keeps coming up to her? What's that? The beadsman isn't at the party, right? The beadsman avoids the party.
Oh, yeah.
She's actually probably more like the beadsman, at least at this point, than she is like other people at the party. Right. In vain came many a tiptoe, amorous cavalier, and back retired, not cooled by high disdain. So what's going on here that these lines are describing? What's happening? What does it mean to be amorous?
Have to be seen.
Think of it, well, amor, right, is Latin for love. Right, a cavalier is a gentleman. So what keeps happening to Madeline at the party?
Guys keep walking up to her.
Yeah, horny guys keep walking up to her, right? And trying to get her to dance or whatever, right? And she is just putting them off. She has no thought for the party, right? She doesn't care to be here. Right? She danced along with vague, regardless eyes, anxious her lips, her breathing quick and short. The hallowed hour was near at hand. She sighs amid the timbrels, and the thronged resort of whisperers in anger or in sport, mid looks of love, defiance, hate, and scorn, hoodwinked with fairy fancy, all amort, save to St. Agnes and her lambs unshorn, and all the bliss to be before tomorrow morn. So the lamb is St. Agnes' symbol. Right? She's associated with the lamb, which is also kind of associated with innocence, right? And with youth. What do we get about, what kind of people are these? Like, what do we learn about the people in Madeline's family and their friends from the party? How do they behave? What are they like? The thronged resort of whisperers in anger or in sport, mid looks of love, defiance, hate, and scorn.
Family drama.
What's that?
There's a lot of family drama.
Yeah, there's drama, right?
Jealous?
Jealousy, yeah.
I was gonna say they could be just hanging around them just because, they got money, maybe.
Yeah. I mean, one of the senses that the poem gives us, right, is that these people are kind of assholes, right? Yeah. Madeline seems to be different from the other people in the room, not just in that she doesn't want to participate in the party, but that she doesn't participate in all of this other shit as well, right? All of this family drama. Now then, Porphyro enters in stanza 9, right? So purposing each moment to retire, she lingered still. Meantime, across the moors had come young Porphyro with heart on fire for Madeline. Beside the portal doors, buttressed from moonlight, stands he and implores all saints to give him sight of Madeline. but for one moment in the tedious hours, that he might gaze and worship all unseen, perchance speak, kneel, touch, kiss, and sooth such things have been. So he's actually doing something kind of like the reverse of the St. Agnes ritual, right? So Madeline is going to go upstairs without any food, strip, pray, go to bed, and wait for a vision of her lover, right? And Porphyro is at the same time praying to all saints outside the house for a vision of Madeline, right? So they're both engaged in kind of the same activity. But Porphyro intends to sneak into the house to make his dream reality, right? And he's helped by this old woman, Angela. Right? He ventures in. Let no buzzed whisper tell, all eyes be muffled, or 100 swords will storm his heart. Love's feverish citadel for him, those chambers held barbarian hordes, hyena foemen and hot-blooded lords, whose very dogs would execrations howl against his lineage. Not one breast affords him any mercy in that mansion foul, save one old beldam, weak in body and soul. So what does this tell us about why Porphyro can't declare his intentions openly?
No kill.
Yeah, kill him.
Yeah. Madeline's family hates him, right? He is their sworn enemy. And if he's caught there, he's a dead man. So there is an element of danger here, right? Right? This is not safe for him to do, right? Ah, happy chance the aged creature came, shuffling along with ivory-headed wand, to where he stood, hid from the torch's flame behind a broad hall pillar, far beyond the sound of merriment and chorus bland. He startled her, but soon she knew his face, and grasped his fingers in her palsied hand, saying, Mercy, Porphyro, hie thee from this place. They are all here tonight, the whole bloodthirsty race. Get hence, there's dwarfish Hildebrand. He had a fever late, and in the fit he cursed thee and thine, both house and land. Then there's that old Lord Morris, not a whit more tame for his gray hairs. Alas me, flit like a ghost away. Ah, gossip dear, we're safe enough here in this armchair. Sit and tell me how. Good saint's not here. Follow me, child, or else these stones will be thy beer. So,
What does she mean by alas me? What does she mean by flit?
flit.
Yeah. what
So,
does she mean?
to flit is to move swiftly away. So yeah, what she said, it's not safe to be here, right? You have to go.
But you see how she said he cursed thee and thine, both house and land, so no one's getting cursed. Well, at this, or she's talking about something that happened.
Yeah, she's not talking about a literal curse like a spell, right?
Okay.
He essentially what she's saying is Hildebrand called you a jerk, right? And threatened you. Yeah, she's not talking about a literal curse here. No one is casting evil spells at each other anyway, right? Now, one thing that I did mention last time is that this bears a strong resemblance to certain tropes of the Gothic, right? And you may remember when we looked at those couple of Gothic texts, the second passage from the monk in particular, right? Where the monk, Ambrosio, sneaks into his sleeping target Antonia's chamber, right? Using a spell. He has that little silver branch that is supposed to make her sleep. And then, her mother catches him, and he gets upset, starts making excuses, and then just smothers her, right? So much of the action in the poem that follows here is actually pretty similar to this scene from the monk, right? There's no spell being cast here, or at least no vicious spell, right? But we do have a young man with clearly expressed sexual desires sneaking into a young woman's home and then into her chambers, right? Now this time the old lady is helping him rather than hindering him. But the basic situation seems to be borrowed from this earlier Gothic text. And the whole idea of a young woman's sexuality sort of being, in some sense, threatened by a male interloper is also a very Gothic situation, right? Even though in this case, Keats revises the situation to make it consensual. Otherwise, this still looks very much like a Gothic plot. Now let's look at how Porphyro gets himself close to Madeline here. Where does he end up in her chamber?
Her closet.
Yeah, he's hiding in the closet, right? And he's watching her while she gets ready to go to bed, right? So if you look on page 966, right? Safe at last, through many a dusky gallery, they gained the maiden's chamber, silken, hushed, and chaste, where Porphyro took covert, pleased amain, his poor guide hurried back with agues in her brain. Her faltering hand upon the balustrade, old Angela was feeling for the stair, when Madeline, St. Agnes' charmed maid, rose like a mission spirit, unaware with silver tapers light and pious care. She turned, and down the ancient gossip led to a safe level matting. Now prepare, young Porphyro, for gazing on that bed. She comes again, like the ring-dove frayed and fled. Now, what follows can be read in terms of a theoretical notion that was formulated by a film critic, a British film critic by the name of Laura Mulvey, that is called the male gaze. And Mulvey's basic argument is that filmmakers in particular, but also painters and writers, will typically frame the female body in ways that make it a kind of object of consumption for the male viewer. Right? So the whole idea is that art presents women as sort of sex objects to a straight male audience, right? And that's kind of exactly the way Madeline is framed here, right? I mean, this is not cool. You should not be hiding in a woman's closet, watching her undress while she goes to bed, right? You know, like this is weird. Yeah, I mean, this is not like sort of, you know, beyond the bounds of propriety. It's invasive, right? He's in her private space, watching her unobserved, and the poem clearly frames her as an object of desire, right? Look, out went the taper as she hurried in. Its little smoke in pallid moonshine died. She closed the door, she panted, all akin to spirits of the air and visions wide, no uttered syllable or woe betide. But to her heart was voluble, painting with eloquence her balmy side, as though a tongueless nightingale should swell her throat in vain and die, heart stifled in her dell. A casement, let's see, okay, I got the casement, don't worry about the casement right now. Full on this casement shone the wintry moon, and threw warm gules on Madeline's fair breast. So gules just means red. Down she knelt for heaven's grace and boon. Rose bloom fell in her hands, together pressed, and on her silver cross soft amethyst, and on her hair a glory like a saint. She seemed a splendid angel, newly dressed, save wings for heaven. Porphyro grew faint. She knelt, so pure a thing, so free from mortal taint. So first he watches her pray, and then anon his heart revives. Her vespers done, of all its wreathed pearls her hair she frees. unclasps her warm jewels one by one, loosens her fragrant bodice. By degrees her rich attire creeps rustling to her knees. Half hidden like a mermaid in seaweed, pensive awhile she dreams awake, and sees in fancy fair St. Agnes in her bed, but dares not look behind, or all the charm is fled. So the vision she sees in her bed is of this patron saint of virginity and chastity, where the great threat to her virginity and chastity is actually behind her, right, in the closet where she is not looking. And this is where we get that scene where Porphyro lays out that feast, right, that you thought was weird, right? So the point of the feast, yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so when he was, that last stanza, was that Porphyro or was that the writer? Because he's saying, like, he's describing her.
Yeah.
But, like, and you said that since, like, she is, like, chastity of a, like, virginity and, you know. And that she doesn't know that, he knows that she is, but he's the one threatening that. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think what the point is, like, the idea of the gaze here is that the reader is being put into Porphyro's position, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what the writer is doing is framing this from Porphyro's point of view.
Okay.
Maybe I didn't explain that clearly. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So the whole idea is that we're seeing things from Porphyro's vantage point.
But it is like he's explaining what's happening, right?
Yeah, yeah.
We're basically being described what he's seeing, but from the outside, he's making us.
Yeah. So essentially, the perspective the reader is placed in is in the closet with Porphyro.
Okay.
Right, watching Madeline do her thing, and then coming out of that closet and setting up this weird feast, right? And I think the whole idea of the feast here, right? On the one hand, like, we've got all of these, you know, exotic foods, right? Bright colors. And, you know, he even plays music for her, right? What's happening here is that we're contrasting the religious significance of the evening, the religious significance of the night, with sensory pleasures. Right? She's been denying her senses all day in order to get this spiritual vision, right? And so what he's doing is bringing her back to worldly sensory pleasures, right? Which will become of a more concrete nature when she wakes up. And in fact, if we look on page 969, we see, though, her waking and dreaming lives kind of blending together, right? She's not sure what is actually going on around her, right? Her eyes were open, but still she beheld, now wide awake, the vision of her sleep. There was a painful change that nigh expelled the blisses of her dream so pure and deep, at which fair Madeline began to weep, and moaned forth witless words with many a sigh, while still her gaze on Porphyro would keep, who knelt with jointed hands and piteous eye, fearing to move or speak, she looked so dreamingly. Ah, Porphyro, said she, but even now thy voice was a sweet tremble in mine ear, made tunable with every sweetest vow. And those sad eyes were spiritual and clear. How changed thou art, how pallid, chill, and drear. Give me that voice again, my Porphyro, those looks immortal, those complainings dear. Oh, leave me not in this eternal woe, for if thou diest, my love, I know not where to go. So, given what she says here, how does Porphyro probably look right now?
Like a creep?
Okay, like a creep. But also, like, he's probably not looking his best either. You know, it's freezing outside. He has just, run across the moors from wherever it is he lives to sneak into this house. So yeah, he probably looks pale and a little sickly and a little bedraggled, right? And so here she wakes up, and here he is next to her. Beyond a mortal man impassioned far, at these voluptuous accents he arose, ethereal, flushed, and like a throbbing star seen mid the sapphire heaven's deep repose, into her dream he melted, as the rose blended its odor with the violet, solution sweet. Meantime the frost wind blows like love's alarum, pattering the sharp sleet against the window panes, St. Agnes Moon had said. So this stanza is sort of a very oblique way of saying seduction accomplished. But there are a couple of interesting things going on here. For one thing, the idea of dream and reality melting together is also taken from the monk. Right? You may recall that Elvira, Antonia's mother, has a premonition that something is threatening her daughter, and that's why she wakes up and goes to Antonia's chamber and tries to stop Ambrosio, right? Well, at the same time, Antonia has been having dreams of something threatening her, right? So in this case, Keats takes the dream and simply like melts the dream together with the living person, right? So the dream here becomes reality, but not in a way that is unpleasant for either of the two figures, right? Porphyro, the shivering, cold, bedraggled figure on the bed, melds with handsome, healthy dream Porphyro. And the two of them dissolve together. Now, the whole notion of solution and dissolving is also important if we think back to the beginning of the poem. What's the status of everything at the beginning of the poem? What was the dominant tone of those first couple of stanzas?
It was cold.
It was cold and frozen, right? Right. We have those knights and ladies who are frozen in that attitude of prayer, right? And so this notion of dissolving now, right? Now we have movement and in fact kind of melting. And a reminder of the cold at the end of the stanza, we have the sharp sleet against the window panes, right? So we have inside heat, warmth, motion, dissolving, melting. Outside and in the chapel, stillness and frost, right? So a lot of the movement in the poem is from stillness to motion generally, right? So now that they've melted, they are going to glide on page 970, stanza 41, like phantoms into the wide hall, right? They become like insubstantial things as they flee from the castle. They glide like phantoms into the wide hall, like phantoms to the iron porch they glide, where lay the porter in uneasy sprawl, with a huge empty flagon by his side. The wakeful bloodhound rose and shook his hide, but his sagacious eye an inmate owns. By one and one the bolts full easily slide, the chains lie silent on the foot-worn stones, the key turns, and the door upon its hinges groans. So they almost turn into ghosts as they escape, right? And does their escape seem to be particularly difficult? No. Now that they are melted, dissolved, whatever, right? They get out pretty easily. Right? They're not stuck either in old patterns and old ways like the beadsmen, or in sort of bondage to a relatively shitty family like Madeline was before, right? And they are gone, ages long ago, these lovers fled away into the storm. That night the Baron dreamt of many a woe, and all his warrior guests, with shade and form of witch and demon large coffin worn, were long be nightmare, right? So again, like bad dreams, right? The Baron and all of his men are having bad dreams. Angela the old died palsy-twitched, with meager face to form. The beadsman, after 1,000 aves told, for ions sought for, slept among his ashes cold. So why do you think we go back to this beadsman at the end of the poem? This elderly celibate who lives in a cold chapel, sleeps in ashes, and is simply paid to pray for the family.
Maybe he wasn't praying this boy, baby.
I'm I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
I said maybe he wasn't praying, that's why the baron was having bad dreams.
Well, you know, but he's you know, the beadsman after 1,000 Aves told us, so he is praying, right? He's doing his job.
Right. Is he praying for the wrong thing?
Or we also might consider, like, do his prayers actually matter?
No. Well, they do, but it's just a matter of how he prayed for them and the situation that they were in already before he prayed.
Well, think of it this way, right? So the beadsman, he's not praying for Madeline, right? He's praying probably for Madeline's father, right? You know, does Madeline's family, the way they're depicted in the poem, do they seem to pay any mind to the chapel or to what the beadsman is doing, or to any such thing, right? So yeah, so essentially they just outsource their prayers to him. Right? He's paid not to pray for himself, but to pray for them. But do they deny themselves any pleasures of this world? No, the beadsman doesn't get any, right? The beadsman has to live this cold, uncomfortable life for their sake. But it doesn't change their behavior in any way, right? Because they just kind of pawn everything off, they're pawning everything off onto him. So the beadsman is basically a dead end, right? Who sleeps on a pile of ashes in a chapel full of unmoving statues. So at the end of the poem, we return to that stasis that we saw at the beginning, right? Everything's frozen again. Right? Madeline and Porphyro get out. The disruptive element is gone. Everything freezes like it was. So we probably want to think a little bit about what to do with that. But I want to shift gears slightly here now. I just kind of want to point that out and like kind of leave. We'll think about that, and we might pick it back up next time. Or this might also be even like a good thing to try to write a response paper on. Yeah, Alex.
Would you consider the whole beadsman, he's praying for them while they're sinning? Would you consider that irony?
Yeah, I think I think it might also be related to. Some of what was going on when noblemen in the 18th century believed in those Gothic follies, right? And they would like hire holy hermits to go live in their woods. I think Keats might have some stuff like that in mind too, right? There's this kind of fake medieval atmosphere, right? You pay people to live like medieval hermits and shit like that, but they're not really serving any purpose, right? It's purely decorative. So I do want to look a little bit at where Keats's inspiration for this poem reportedly came from. So there's a town in West Sussex in southeastern England called Chichester. And Chichester is remarkable for its well-preserved medieval architecture. And supposedly Keats was staying in Chichester at the time that he began writing the poem, and so was likely inspired by the atmosphere there. So this is where West Sussex is in England. So for reference, remember the Lake District was up here. So where the early Romantics are situated is just about as far from West Sussex as you can get and still be in England, right? So we're at very different poles here. West Sussex is not nearly as far from London, for example. So this is the old city wall and gate. We have here a detached bell tower that is part of the cathedral complex. And we see, like these windows, these are the casements that the poem is talking about, or windows in that style, right? This is called a casement. This is the market cross in the middle of town. Most English towns, if they're old enough, have what's called a market cross. And essentially it is just a cross that is meant to mark like where the weekly market met, right? Where people would come to buy and sell and trade. This is the inside of Chichester Cathedral, right? You can see all of these kind of buttressed openings, right? We've got the casement windows in the back. So this is the kind of atmosphere you should be thinking about as you read a poem like this, right? This is kind of visually a lot of the sort of thing that is being conjured up. This is another shot of the inside of the cathedral. And this is what the outside of it looks like. So again, Keats doesn't have a religious site in mind here for the setting of the poem, but much of the visual language of the poem is inspired by the medieval architecture of this town. All right, so we're going to leave it there. We're reading Mary Shelley for next time. We're going to be looking at a Romantic era example of science fiction. I'll send you the discussion questions this afternoon. And because I didn't give you a quiz on this, what should you expect come Wednesday night? Exactly.